Well, yeah.
Alrighty, so why? Listen up, please. Stop talking. Pay attention. Why is soil? What are the properties of soil that make it so gosh darn important for plants? Well, there's several things that it does. One, very basically, is it offers an ideal medium for roots to set down into and form support. You know, it's loose enough, depending upon the soil, for root penetration to take place, but then it's dense enough to, once it's sitting on top of the roots and the roots are firmly established in there, to hold sometimes trees that are, you know, thousands of tons in mass. So that's an important thing. Plants have got to grow up. They've got to grow towards the sunlight and everything, so they obviously need that. There are some plants that compensate for not being able to do that with vines and things like that, but the majority of your plants need to have some firm physical foundation for them. Minerals, we've talked about this quite a bit when we talked about the lithosphere. Remember way back when? And the rock cycle, and how when mountains and other landforms, etc., were formed, that they are then worked on by wind and erosion and weathering, and broken up into little bits of rock, and those you know, flow downhill, deposit downhill sediment and everything like that, and form the sands and stuff, and then stuff grows in them. That's the beginning of soil, once you start getting some growth and things in there. Well, those little bits of rock and things, they are chemical compound substances that have things in them like calcium and phosphorus and iron and magnesium and all those other kind of minerals that plants need, and of course we need as well. And so this is where they get primarily into the food chain, is through plants absorbing them from the soil, and then that supplies them with their mineral needs. Part of it. We'll see the next, there's another part to that as well. But that's the primary place that plants get their minerals, and therefore we and the rest of the food chain gets the minerals. Retaining water. Now, this is a lot of plants get their primary water supply from the topsoil, grasses and things like that. And so that means that that soil needs to have something in it that will cause water to cling to it. A lot of times it's organic stuff like humus, and sometimes it's just the size of the rock particles that are in there. And we'll talk about it more in a minute. But it needs to be able to hold on to some of that moisture, the soil moisture. Okay, this is a little bit different, by the way, or it's actually very different from the aquifer, from the water that drains down and becomes part of the aquifer underneath. You need to have, for plants, you need to have a certain amount of retention time where the water stays in the soil for a little bit before it either dries up and evaporates or before it sinks down in there, because that soil moisture is what a lot of your plants, that's where they absorb their soil. Okay. So conversely, it kind of works in the opposite way, is the fact that plants also need to have soil with airspace in them. Because plants do use oxygen, they do respire, they break down the glucose for their own energy needs. And most of the time they absorb that oxygen through their roots. And so consequently you need some air spaces in your soil as well. That's why, depending upon the plant, now if you've got a wetland plant, they're well adapted to having soils that are wet all the time, of course, and everything. But for most plants, your terrestrial plants, that soil does need to have those air pockets in it, and if it doesn't, those plants will literally drown. They won't be able to get their air supplies that they need. So these two, air and water retention, kind of work opposite of each other. You want a certain amount of water retention for the plants to get, but you need a certain amount of air in there as well, and vice versa. So you need to have a good balance for that. And then finally, it is the site for decomposition. So this is where the majority of bacteria and funguses live. They're sheltered from the sunlight. That UV radiation kills them. So they're underground there, and then of course waste products from all the other organisms in the food chain will tend to fall down onto the ground in the soil. And they can feast upon it there, do their things. They break down the carbon from that, from those organic biological molecules, the waste. That's what's released in the atmosphere is carbon dioxide. But the minerals, back here again, are released from them. That's basically the bacteria and fungus waste products. And that's what plants need they can only absorb minerals as minerals. They can't absorb them when they're in a biological or organic compound. So this decomposition is a recycling part of the process. So what you see in here for plants is you have two-part input. One part is a kind of a slow release from the little bits of rock and everything that are in the soil. and then you have a quicker release there from death and waste products and things like that that naturally go into the soil. I mentioned a few times that we, of course, humans do things wrong in that when we get our food, we are taking it away from the soil in which it was grown in. You know, if you're out in natural ecosystems, you're eating, you're pooping or whatever else, and you're generally in the same, hopefully not directly in the same place, but in close to the same place. So that apple tree that you just ate an apple off of, you go underneath that, and the plants, the minerals and stuff can get absorbed back in the apple tree, you can make more apples. But of course we don't do that, usually, hopefully. You're not out pooping in an orange grove or something like that. You don't dump grandma off in a cornfield. But that would be the natural way to do things. It's illegal, but it'll be the natural way to do things. And we, as you know, as people, don't do that. Okay? But we'll get into that more when we look at agriculture. So, so those are the primary properties of soil that are so important for plant life and why it's very well suited for that. What do we do to damage that? Anthropogenic activities that clear forests is correct, so I'll give you the points for that. And forests are probably the most important one that we clear and tend to lead to soil erosion from. But I'm just going to say plants in general. Because plants and soil have kind of a mutualistic relationship. It's not like a true biological mutualistic relationship because soil is not an organism on its own. But plants need soil, as we just described. And then once the plants take root in the soil and the root system spread out and they're healthy plants, they then keep the soil held in place. Because if you don't have the plants in the soil, that soil is going to be exposed and it's going to be subject to wind and water erosion. So that's one of the big impacts we have when we go out and clear cut a whole forest or even a grassland area. We convert that into a farm or perhaps some city block stuff and everything where you dig everything up and you expose that soil, the wind and water can come along and blow it away or wash it away. All right, so those are things that can increase, those are activities that increase the physical erosion of soil. But another thing that can happen to soil is that it can lose its minerals, demineralize. So that typically happens from two things, one of which is acid deposition, and this can affect both farms as well as forests and natural ecosystems. And we've mentioned before acid rain. We're going to go into a lot more detail on that when we look at the air pollution unit, but that's the air pollution, the form of air pollution called acid precipitation. That will come down, and acids dissolve minerals. That's one of their chemical properties. So these minerals that are in the soil and the rocks and stuff, they typically will dissolve slowly. Actually, they dissolve the same reason because of small amounts of acids that are produced by the bacteria on the plant roots. So it's a slow process like most things in nature, and it works out real well. However, if the rainfall becomes acidic and it changes the soil pH quite a bit, then you're going to dissolve these minerals even more, and it's going to wash them right away. To give you an idea of the relationship between acids and minerals, the cleaning products like Lime Away and Clear and things like that, and they always talk about removing the hard water stains and things like that. Those hard water stains are mineral deposits, iron or calcium or something like that. So they're not very soluble normally. You know that if you try to clean them. But you put the Lime Away and Clear, those are acids. Those are mild acids. You could do the same thing with vinegar or lemon juice, or some people even use soda. And it dissolves them away. Point being is that's what acids do chemically. So if the precipitation is acidic, then you're going to wash some of these minerals out up here. And of course that's going to lead to soil that's not going to be able to support plant life like it did before. Now, poor farming techniques, of course, that's an issue in agriculture, but one of the things we see is that if you constantly farm the same thing over and over again, you end up depleting the soil because plants have specific needs. So they will end up taking out one particular key element from the soil, and then it won't be able to support that crop anymore. So there's things you can do to alleviate that. So if you demineralize the soil, then of course the plants will no longer grow in it. If the plants don't grow in it, then it's left exposed and you can get wind and water erosion. Okay? Questions about anthropogenic things that human societies do that deplete the soil? All right, so let's look at conservation. You know, in nature, generally the conservation thing is to preserve all your plants, your plant life and material like that. That's about the only thing you can do. There's some other things, like you can put down hay bales and stuff, but on a large scale basis, that won't help. You need to just keep the trees and the plants there as much as possible, or if you do clear in strips. And as a matter of fact, when we do forestry techniques, we'll look at that more in detail. But just to preserve as much of the plant life as possible, that's going to keep your soil in place. But of course, that's, you know, it's a different situation on a farm. So certain specific things they do in agriculture to preserve their soil, because of course it is a very important resource. Low volume irrigation, because when you overwater, that extra water will run off, it'll wash out, and it's going to take the soil with it. It's going to erode it away. So you want to only water as, you know, water as much, I mean, water with the minimal amount possible. That, of course, is good water resource management as well. So the two go hand in hand there. Same thing with leveling. Once again, runoff is your enemy when it comes to soil erosion. So make things as even as possible. Leveling, contour plowing, and terracing. So those things we've already talked about a little bit, because when it comes to runoff, you don't want it. Not only does it deplete the soil or wash the soil away, but it also is a bad use of water resources. So we've already talked about this a little bit. Strip farming, that's a little bit different. This is when you use close sown crops. That means crops whose individual plants grow close together and typically will have a dense root network. Wheat is an example of that. And the reason for that is wheat is a grass. Okay? What? I don't know what the joke is. No? Alright, so wheat is a grass. Grasses, as you know, they have root systems and runners and things like that, and so wheat as a crop is not very subject to soil erosion, not as much as individual plants or what you might call row crops such as peas or some other plants that are individual plants, strawberries. You know, that'd be another example. Things like that. So you may, you know, if everybody grew wheat, of course, it wouldn't have very many soil erosion problems, but you'd have a glut on the wheat market. So you might intersperse wheat in with these other crops, and then maybe you're, you know, more profitable or something like that, or there's a need for it. So that's called strip farming. No-till farming. Okay, tilling the soil is an agricultural practice that's been done probably since agriculture's been done. It's just basically where you turn the ground, break up the ground, any plants and stuff you cut and grind under and turn under and stuff like that. Leaves you with nice, loose soil, very good for germinating, very easy to plant seeds in, and that's why it's been done for tens of thousands of years. But whenever you do that, you're definitely exposing, you're making that soil the most vulnerable to erosion. Because now not only is it exposed, it's also all turned up and loosened up. Whereas you have some, if it's compacted down as it will, you know, do over time, it's not as much a problem. So the old style method is to till. The newer method is to either leave the plant in the ground if it's an annual plant, as many of them are, again, it'll naturally die, or to spray the old crop with herbicide before you put in the new crop. Then they take the seeds and they push them deep down underneath the dead plants and stuff. So as those old plants die and decay, the seeds germinate and they come up through it, and the old plant material, the roots and all that kind of stuff are left in the ground. They hold the soil in place. So what they're finding is, it's, you know, they would think before that all that old plant material was too much of an impediment to the growth of the seedlings. They're finding that that's not the case so much. They still have a good chance of coming up and living and growing. Which, of course, is how it is out in nature as well. All right, windbreaks. So, crops. No, I'm sorry, good fact. The crops are what you're trying to protect. You plant trees. Okay, so basically, when you have a windbreak, it is a wall to reduce the wind erosion. Trees, of course, are very effective in that. That's also why back up here, clearing trees is probably the worst thing. Deforestation is the worst thing you can do, because not only does it expose the roots and stuff or the soil for washout, but it doesn't stop the wind. The wind always increases when you cut down the trees, because the trees, of course, block the wind somewhat. So that's what a windbreak is. And this one, by the way, this actually should be down here underneath denitrification. I kind of put this in the wrong place. But we're going to talk about denitrification now. So these are some of the things you can do for wind and water erosion prevention. And then to, excuse me, not denitrification, demineralization to reduce that. What's up?
I have frequency
You do what?
here.
Not to mine. I think you need to go out here, take a left down the hallway. It's the first stop. It's the one to the left. I don't know. All right. So one of the things that we do in farming that chemically reduces it, that reduces the mineral content in it, is monoculture, planting the same thing over and over again. So this has been more common, of course, in industrial agriculture, because you need the convenience of planting the same thing. You have the same type of harvesting equipment, things like that. Everything is geared towards that. Whereas on a traditional farm, of course, you would tend to have a polyculture. You grow some corn, you grow some potatoes, maybe. You know, you grow all kinds of things, some fruit, etc., because you're feeding your family off of that farm. So polycultures is the way to go. That means, of course, planting a variety of different crops, and therefore you don't have one particular crop extracting all of a particular mineral out of the soil. Something very similar to that is crop rotation. You've probably heard of this before, and this is basically planting a different crop every year. And also one of the things I would add to this is letting the area lay fallow, which basically means to not plant anything on, just let the natural weeds and stuff take over for a year. But you rotate your crops, and it's particularly effective if you use types of crops called legumes, types of plants called legumes. Now, legumes are important because they have a mutualistic relationship with nitrogen-fixing bacteria. And nitrogen-fixing bacteria are the ones that take the nitrogen directly out of the atmosphere, the N2, and convert it into ammonium. You guys all remember that, right? Nitrogen cycle, wasn't that long ago. All right, so that is, of course, that is a nutrient. That's a nitrogen nutrient. That's an input, nitrogen input for those plants as well as plants that are around them. So not only will it help those plants, the legume plants, but also enriches the soil with nitrogen. So it's like their own little self-fertilizing plants. So that's why ideally you can include legumes in the mix to enrich the soil there. Using organic waste, yeah, it would be organic waste, so I'll take that. I'm really just looking at, in general, organic fertilizer. Like cow manure, like crop waste, you know, the stuff, the parts of the plants that you're not going to eat or process or whatever, you can grind those back in and mulch them and compost them and things like that, and use those. Those are better than chemical fertilizers because they stay in the soil for longer. Whereas the chemical fertilizers are easily washed out. And also with your organic fertilizer, there's fibrous biological content, there's decaying whatever, cellulose and stuff. That helps to hold water as well. So that's another benefit of using that. And then finally, acid deposition control. Most acid rain comes from sulfur dioxide. Sulfur dioxide reacts with water vapor in the clouds to form sulfuric acid. That's the main type of main component of acid rain. That primarily comes from burning fuels like coal that have sulfur in them. And we'll study this some more in detail, very much more in detail in the air pollution unit. But just know right now that the less of that, the less acid rain there would be. And then if you do have acidified soil, then you can, what would you add to that to reduce that, to neutralize it? What kind of substance? To neutralize an acid? Base. So a basic chemical. The most common type is the compound calcium oxide, which is also known as lime. Questions? All right, let me tally up your points, and then we've got a few diagrams to look at here. The diagrams and things are particularly important on this. Everybody got it? Oh, still rolling, all right.